Sure.
Caroline, on the tariffs, can you clarify whether those will actually be going into effect tomorrow? Or
Yes.
there might be some lead time.
Yes.
And are those, they will be going into effect?
Correct.
And are those meant to be in place long term, or is there a scenario in which Canada, Mexico, and China can offer concessions and then they would be removed?
At this point, the president has made it very clear those tariffs are going to be implemented and in effect. If the president at any time decides to roll back those tariffs, I'll leave it to him to make that decision. But starting tomorrow, those tariffs will be in place.
That's starting right now. Waiting for an update from the White House on this. What looks like it's going to be 25% right now. When I come back, what's the real problem here that very few people are actually discussing? And what can we do about this? Is there some hope on the horizon? Well, we'll see when we come back. We need political change. But we also need the resolve to resist. Yes, please like the station. If you can, give us a thumbs up. It's very important for a small station like this, which wants to be larger. Thank you for your support this week. It's been outstanding. We've had some great shows. I hope you enjoyed my interview with Liz Truss. We talked to Neil Oliver. We had a great week. Really, really enthused about the response. Thank you for your subscriptions. Resubscribe if you must. Trying to hit that 40,000 plateau. It's important. And with the larger the membership, the larger the subscribers, the easier it is to beat the YouTube censorship, which occurs every day. And I can't emphasize that enough. But thank you so much for your support. Okay. Oftentimes a war will begin, and I'll get to the guts of this broadcast in a minute, but you can spare me a brief monologue here. People often forget why wars started. There's a great line from Gone with the Wind where Ashley Wilkes is asked if he's ready to be a part of the Civil War. Isn't he happy the Civil War is beginning? And he says, oftentimes, after the war is all over, people forget what it was all about. And that certainly could be said about the Great War, the First World War. So many millions of people thrown into that cannon fodder destruction. For what? For the destruction of Western civilization? For the rise of Bolshevism? For the end of monarchies across Europe that could have been transformed into constitutional monarchies? So that the military-industrial establishment of that age could feed off the corpses of those who died in the trenches and elsewhere and make millions, billions, trillions in today's dollars. What was that war all about? When it was all over and the millions, the tens of millions were dead, the billions, the trillions of treasury spent, the empires vanquished and wasted, people wondered why they had this war. Could it not have been averted? Now, I'm not comparing this trade war between the U.S., Mexico, and Canada with the First World War. Not actually. I'm just saying it's about as dumb. It's about as meaningless as the First World War ultimately was. And I love this headline from the Wall Street Journal. The dumbest trade war in history. I encourage you to read this. I don't always like the Wall Street Journal. I know sometimes it can be woke, sometimes it can be left-wing, sometimes it can be hostile. But this is a very good article because it outlines just how crazy this is. We have been moving towards an integrated economy now for 40 years. Ever since Brian Mulroney and Ronald Reagan sat down and agreed to the Canada-US free trade deal. Now, I know Mexico is a problem in this triumvirate trade agreement, but Canada and the US are identical countries in so many ways. Yes, our bureaucracies tend to be deep state-ish. They tend to be too woke, but they're nowhere near as corrupt as the bureaucracy in Mexico or most of Central America and much of South America. So we have so much we can be building on. We don't need a trade war right now. It's completely unnecessary. Now, I know this is largely Justin Trudeau's fault because he refused to do anything about border security, except pretend to spend $1.3 billion. And nobody is even acknowledging this. I don't know why I seem to be the only one crying in the wilderness about this right now, that this 1.3 billion is totally based on future projections. It's not even being spent right now. This is not a plan. It was never a plan. But I'm going to get in a minute to what the real danger is. Donald Trump keeps talking about fentanyl. He keeps talking about the danger of fentanyl. And we keep saying, hey, there's like 43 pounds of fentanyl have been seized at the Canadian border. Sorry, we're getting that drastically wrong. Before I forget, have a look at my human events column from yesterday. I really enjoyed writing this because Colombia got it right away about the tariff. It didn't want the 25% tariff. So it decided within hours to accept these illegals that Donald Trump was shipping back to Colombia via military transport to Bogota. Now, initially, Colombia said, no, forget it. We're not taking these illegals back. You can keep them. Trump said 25% tariff if you don't. Within hours, Colombia changed its tune and said, yeah, I guess we'll take our criminal illegals back, even though for some reason they seemed to think they weren't their problem anymore. But of course they're their problem. Now, how has Justin Trudeau reacted to this? Well, Justin Trudeau is usually at his insouciant best when faced with bad news. It's always somebody else's problem. And the information for this will be in the description, by the way. Justin Trudeau is always saying it's not my problem. It was forced on me. And of course, it would be very easy for Justin Trudeau to blame this tariff war entirely on Donald Trump, even though Justin Trudeau has utterly failed to do anything to satisfy Donald Trump's demands with the border in this regard. He's done nothing. As I said, spent not a dime on border security. We've talked about doing a lot. And it really is a farce. Let's listen to Justin's response here. I find this quite interesting.
Trump stated yesterday he is still committed to placing tariffs on Canada starting as early as tomorrow, possibly. Now, we don't know precisely what that could look like, but I do know two things. First, if the president does choose to implement any tariffs against Canada, we're ready with a response. A purposeful, forceful, but reasonable, immediate response. We won't relent until tariffs are removed, and of course, everything is on the table. Part of what this council has been doing is pulling together perspectives from across industries, from across different parts of the country, to make sure that anything we do will be fair right across the country, that all Canadians will share in the job of standing up for our interests and, quite frankly, standing up to defend the most successful trading relationship in the world. Of course, I won't sugarcoat it. Our nation could be facing difficult times in the coming days and weeks.
Yeah, well, we've been facing difficult times ever since you occupied the office of Prime Minister in Canada. And those difficult times are going to get worse right now, partially because you have completely forfeited your responsibility. You've abdicated your responsibility for border security. And I'm going to get to this in a minute. I can't wait. But it's interesting. Trump has talked about 10% tariff on oil. Now, why do you suppose that would have happened? probably because Daniel Smith was the only Canadian politician actually lobbying. She's the only one that came up with some good solutions. She talked about the borders czar. We dealt with that extensively yesterday. I ask again today, where is Conservative Party of Canada leader Pierre Poilievre? I've asked the Conservative Party communications team for an interview with Mr. Poilievre, whom I have known for 2 decades, and they're thinking about it. And I would love to have Mr. Poilievre on the show to talk about whether he supports the idea of a border czar. And for him to talk about something else for 5 minutes other than carbon tax Carney and Chrystia Freeland, and to actually talk about the tariff problem and the border security problem. He doesn't seem to be aware either that Justin Trudeau has done nothing to alleviate the border security issue. Nothing. Every time Poilievre talks about the border security issue, he says, well, we did spend $1.3 billion, yes, and doesn't seem to know that that's over 6 years. So I'd love to talk to him about that. But Donald Trump is saying oil might be sort of partially exempt from his tariffs because somebody probably told him that, yeah, the U.S. has a lot of oil, but it's not the right kind of oil. It's not the right kind of oil for American refineries to use. And nobody seems to realize this. The U.S. produces what is labeled as sweet crude. Canada produces a more, shall we say, stronger variant with a higher sulfur content. That kind of crude can only be refined at certain refineries that the United States specializes in. Most U.S. refineries are adapted for the sulfuric crude. That's why the United States imports so much Canadian oil, and it will continue. Did Donald Trump have a revelation about that? Did he wake up yesterday morning realizing, yeah, there's a problem here not importing Canadian oil? Did Daniel Smith communicate that to him? Probably. I think she did because she's aware of it. She's aware that this trade deficit, which is nowhere near $200 billion, it's more like $45 billion, is largely due, is all due, as a matter of fact, to energy, oil. That's why there's any trade deficit at all between the US and Canada. In terms of goods and services, if you take energy products out of that equation, the US has a trade surplus with Canada. Does Donald Trump know this? I don't know. We've not been very good communicating that to Donald Trump either. Has this government? It has totally failed in that regard. But here's the issue of the hour. Donald Trump keeps talking about fentanyl. Fentanyl coming through the northern border. And of course, the Trudeau government keeps saying, oh, it's only 45 pounds. It's less than 1% of fentanyl coming through Canada. Yeah, maybe at the U.S.-Canadian border per se. But how much is getting in Canadian ports? This is why I'm still hoping to get my friend Sam Cooper on the show to talk about this. I invited him again today. I think he's kind of busy this morning. But here's a clip he did from another show recently. And I want to delve into this further with him. But I think Sam has discovered, and you can watch his material, you can read his material on Substack. It's the Bureau. He's a best-selling author. We've discussed his book here. This is the guy, I think, who's actually discovered the root problem of Canadian border security and what Trump is really talking about. Why can't we be clearer, more concise in what the actual problem is? Why is fentanyl a problem? Well, Trump's not made it clear. Trudeau's not even acknowledged it's a problem. Sam Cooper is talking about it right here. Let's have a listen to this.
Yeah, I mean, you're right to point to my book. The very first edition, on the cover, it shows a graphic photo of Vancouver, on a world map, with fentanyl pills exploding out of Vancouver and going around the world. So you could say that, for 10 years, I've been researching the thesis that Canada has become a node of essentially Chinese infiltration and organized crime activity, especially in Vancouver. And this was hard for people to believe, but Vancouver has become a production hub for China and a transshipment hub for fentanyl precursors, to the point where it's now established, even though I was well ahead of the curve in writing up this thesis, that Canada is a fentanyl exporter nation. And so this gets to what Donald Trump is saying. It's hard for many people to believe that Canada could be put in the same category as Mexico in terms of endangering the United States with fentanyl, with illegal immigration and human trafficking. But my research has showed that indeed this is the fear and concern of U.S. intelligence community, U.S. military and law enforcement, really for decades, that Canada's weak enforcement against transnational crime, weak control of borders, has allowed international organized crime with linkages to hostile states, most specifically China, but also Iran, Middle Eastern states that are not friends of the United States, have set up very strongly in Canada. So I do think that as a Canadian, I have to say, I'm not pleased with Donald Trump's rhetoric. I think there's a lot of the art of the deal going on when he's trolling and saying, you're going to be the 51st state. But I do say that there's very deep concerns that Canada is being used by China in a very sophisticated economic and really criminal way. I do think that's correct.
I think Sam has got the answer here. We need to deal with this fentanyl problem. You remember Justice Hogue the other day when she had a so-called news conference without a single question, where she essentially said, there's a problem, but it's not that concerning, and no traitors in the House of Commons. But listen to what she said at the very beginning, because I think maybe she was alluding to the fentanyl problem here.
Firstly, that certain foreign states are attempting to interfere in our electoral processes and democratic institutions. This is not a new phenomenon, nor should it surprise us. States have been trying to interfere with each other since the dawn of time. What is new, however, are the means being deployed by these states.
Okay, what is new here, Madame Hogue, is that China is shoving its fentanyl through the Vancouver ports of entry because China controls so much of the Canadian border that way. Now, this is absolutely fascinating. Now, I want to do a quick pivot here to Mark Carney. And listen to what Mark Carney had to say about the border crisis. What Mark Carney had to say about tariffs. Talking tough. This is a tough man. We'll get to that in a minute. This man is dangerous for Canada. And I'm not going to keep calling him carbon tax Carney. He's net zero Carney. He's economic destruction Carney. Let's listen to why.
The large polluters pay. And so what happens... But does that not ultimately... But the large polluters pay. And so what happens... But does that not ultimately trickle down? No, because what the big companies are producing, by and large, are not products that we are consuming. There's some element of that, but by and large, a steel company, how much steel are you using these days, Todd? I mean, not as much we used. Sorry, so that's how much steel are you using these days, Todd?
What's called the output.
All right. Yes, he just said we don't use steel in Canada anymore. Why? Because we're going back to a Stone Age economy where we don't build anything? Is that what Mark Carney envisions for Canada? I think so. He just said it there. And I'm so sick of Mark Carney being presented as some sort of intellectual, as some sort of smart guy who understands the international economic system so well. He's been the governor of the Bank of England, where he was a disaster. He's been the governor of the Bank of Canada, where he was a disaster. He understands the world economic system. My God, he's a constant guest at the World Economic Forum. He knows this. The man actually doesn't seem to understand anything. I think I would get a better dissertation on the Canadian economy from anybody who protested at the Freedom Convoy, because this man is totally artificial.
And large.
Will pay. The important, and there is an expectation, as you know, that price will rise over the course of this decade. Provide them with more options to reduce emissions because they will be able to pay for the emission reductions of Canadian households.
All right, hold everything. He just said he's talking about his corporate carbon tax. Yes, now he's very much opposed to a personal carbon tax. It's just, and the reason is that Pierre Poilievre won the propaganda war there, and we have to move on. He's expecting corporations to pay everything. No trickle-down effect, by the way. That's not going to happen. And it's just going to work out fine, where all of these corporations end up paying the bills for everybody. What's going to happen, do you suppose? I think the corporations are going to leave Canada. They're going to get the hell out of here, because this sounds like a scenario for disaster. Sounds like it's a scenario for bankruptcy for companies who are going to be forced to pick up the tab for Carney's artificial carbon cost, this so-called price on pollution, this BS terminology.
Take out the carbon tax. You should replace it with something that is at least, if not more, effective.
And once you put in place the sort of shadow prices, so in other words...
All right, this is incredible. Listen carefully. Here he is lecturing BlackRock CEO Larry Fink. Sorry.
The carbon tax, you should replace it with something that is at least, if not more, effective.
And once you put in place the sort of shadow prices, so in other words, regulation on hydrogen fuel blends, phasing out internal combustion engines, expectations of floors on carbon prices, all the things that Janet Yellen and I were, kind of alluding to in this report, the sort of future path of policy.
Yeah, that was Larry Fink, of BlackRock. That's the same Mark Carney 5 years ago. He wants to get rid of the internal combustion engine. He's still Mr. Net Zero. He's just talking a little lighter now in terms of, well, it might not be a personal carbon tax, but we'll stick it to those companies and those corporations who will then either stick it back to us or will leave the country to survive. That's the Canada that Mark Carney is producing.
Trump's tariffs on Canada could be imposed as early as tomorrow. President Trump thinks Canada will cave in. We will never, ever bow down to a bully. Now, let me be clear. This situation, unfortunately, could not be more serious. And at times like these, we need serious leadership and a serious plan. I'm ready to stand up for Canada.
In relation to what's happening in the U.S., what are you proposing Canada can do about the tariffs that you say maybe, we all know may be coming into effect tomorrow?
We have many cards. We're keeping all our cards. We're not turning over any of our cards face up. We clearly have signaled, and there should be no doubt for anyone in the United States, that we will impose retaliatory dollar-for-dollar tariffs if these measures are put in place. We will target those tariffs where they have maximum impact in the United States and minimum impact in Canada. We will support our companies and workers that are most affected. We'll recycle the money from those tariffs to support them.
All right, is this guy capable of answering a question that's not laden with metaphors and meaningless statements? What is he talking about? Cards, not showing our cards. Yeah, you'd better show your cards. So there's some explanation here, some understanding, mutual understanding about what you're actually preparing to do. So this guy is locked into a means of communication that is so poor, it really makes no sense at all. And I can tell you where Mark Carney is sending us, into economic oblivion, if this man is allowed to become prime minister. I shudder to think what he could even do in a couple of weeks as prime minister, let alone somehow be elected in a 4-year term. Now, to get back to Chinese interference, do you think this is a problem? Yes. And so does this CSIS whistleblower, the CSIS agent, who couldn't believe what the Hogue inquiry concluded.
The law enforcement to be capable to act. And when she says that she found no evidence that elected officials purposely or intentionally decided to work with foreign state, well, I would say return to your books, because we have plenty of evidence at CSIS and DRC.
Yes, they have plenty of evidence. And there's plenty of evidence that China is fueling the fentanyl epidemic in the United States. Now, it's very true. People point out and say, well, there would be no fentanyl epidemic if there wasn't a ready market, a willing market for that product in the United States and in Canada, as a matter of fact. But China is exploiting that weakness, and they're using Canada as a means of infesting the United States with a fentanyl product that is lethal, debilitating, and economically catastrophic. I think we can do a little better. But I say again, at the end of this broadcast, I say this again. We need Pierre Poilievre to stand up today and to say this tariff is unacceptable. Canada can do better, especially on border security. He needs to stand beside Danielle Smith and say, we need a border czar. That's an idea that's been accepted by a lot of former military general officers. In fact, the Canadian government, the federal government's actually thinking about it. Now, do we have some wiggle room with Donald Trump right now in terms of offsetting this tariff, or at least putting it off for a month, or perhaps getting it repealed because we exercise some degree of good faith in maintaining and enhancing border security? I think so. But we have to do more than putting idiots like Mark Carney in front of the camera who say we're going to get tough with Donald Trump and we're going to make the corporations pay. We're going to make the rich pay for climate change. This man is not a serious contender for dog catcher. Mark Carney is a farcical character who pretends to be an outsider. He's the biggest insider in the Liberal government and the World Economic Forum and the globalist cabal. He is Mr. Insider. He represents policies that fail. He represents policies that are destructive, corrosive, and catastrophic to the economy. He was a disaster as a Bank of Canada governor and a Bank of England governor. He will be a disaster as a prime minister in Canada because he has no conception of what works. He still thinks climate change theology should be leading the economy. He still thinks the train hasn't passed. It has with Donald Trump as president. The Green New Deal is over. Ideas about banning gasoline-operated cars, that's passé. It's history. We are entering a new dawn where people like Mark Carney are no longer relevant. Their ideas are not just arcane, they are completely false. And we have to acknowledge it's time to move on, Mark Carney. You are yesterday's man. You were very much a part of the Trudeau regime for the past decade. You have no relevance to the next 10 years or even the next 10 months. It's time Canadians recognized we need new elections. We need a new government, one that's not liberal or led by Mark Carney. And Pierre Poilievre needs to be part of this conversation right now, today, Saturday, Sunday, Monday. He needs to be front and center about the tariff problem, the trade war, and the border security crisis. He needs to inject himself into that controversy, that dialogue, that conversation right now. It's not too late, but we need that concerted effort. And stop listening to your communications people who tell you, keep your mouth shut about the border. Keep your mouth shut about the tariffs. Keep your mouth shut about Donald Trump. Keep talking about carbon tax, Carney. Sorry, you're wrong. It's time to adapt to the given situation, to the reality of the hour. It's time to move forward with a new message. Not that your old one was wrong. You were 100% correct. And you are 100% correct. But you've got to evolve. You've got to move on with a more timely message about what's happening today. That's all I'm going to say. I'm over time. Thank you so much for watching. And don't forget to visit our store. We'll be back again tomorrow, and don't miss the Sami Parvez show tonight. I'm a guest. I try to get on his show once a week. He's a great guy, young journalist, trying to do his best, and he does his best, trying to tell you the news that he thinks is important. I love to support his show. I'll be on tonight, I think at 4:00. We agreed to, but have a look. Always a pleasure to be on Sami's show. I support young journalists who want to tell the truth. I think that's important. Thanks for joining me today. I'll be back again tomorrow at 10:00, maybe 9. Sometimes it depends on when I have to get to church. But back again tomorrow morning. Thanks for watching today. God bless you. Have a great Saturday.